The Bible is full of contradictions. Jennifer Bird speaks of some of them in her first chapter. I trust you remember many of the contradictions she highlights. To Bird's list, I add that Genesis 19 does not make it clear how many daughters Lot has. At one point, there's talk of the daughters not having known a man, and there's talk about the daughters having husbands. Lot has sons-in-laws. Psalm 22 suggests God will forsake God's children, but Psalm 46 argues God is a very present help indeed. The father of Zerubbabel is Pedaiah in 1 Chronicles 3, but Shealtiel in Ezra 2. The census count for the Israelites is 800,000 in 2 Samuel 24, but 1,100,000 in 1 Chronicles 21. Biblical scholars have invested enormous amounts of resources in order to understand these contradictions. One of the major, long-held explanations for biblical contradictions, at least in the Pentateuch, is the documentary hypothesis. The purpose of this mini lecture podcast is to familiarize you with the documentary hypothesis, which Collins discusses in his second chapter. Because as classically trained seminarians, you should be familiar with the documentary hypothesis. Today, I am interested in making sure you have a sense of the history or background of the hypothesis and the basic elements of the hypothesis. The documentary hypothesis. Source criticism is an interpretive method or exegetical method that seeks to answer the questions created by repetitions and inconsistencies in the biblical text. The use of two distinct names for God in Genesis. Contradictory styles of writing that appear side by side in a single book. For example, calling the covenant mountain Mount Sinai in one line and Mount Horeb in the next. Also, the act of repeating whole incidents a few chapters apart. For instance, the strange tale of how a patriarch lies in telling a foreign king that his wife is really his sister occurs in Genesis 12, Genesis 20, and Genesis 26. This sort of thing led 18th century German and English researchers to explore the written sources for the Pentateuch. Julius Wellhausen, in his book Prolegomena to the History of Ancient Israel, identified 4 clear written sources in the first 5 books of the Bible. His schema became known as the documentary hypothesis. As we talk about the documentary hypothesis, I want you to think about what you know about quilts and quilt making. I do not sew, but what I know about quilting is it requires the knitting together of pieces that are not originally part of the same swath. In the same way that different patches are sewn together with different hands who would have different stitch patterns, so are different stories of the Pentateuch sewn together via the documentary hypothesis. An important characteristic of Wellhausen's documentary hypothesis is its attention to the potential history of how each source came to be. You may also find this hypothesis referred to as J E, D, and P. With it, the biblical studies student not only can discover 4 different authors and their literary styles, but can picture the time and place from which each source emanates. The first source is the Yahwist source. This source is abbreviated with a J and is also known as the J source. The Yahwist forms the heart of the Pentateuchal structure because all of the various traditions are built around its basic plot, as first found in J. The plot contains 7 steps. 1. Stories of human origins. 2. The promise of the patriarchs. 3. The oppression in Egypt. 4. The exodus from Egypt. 5. The wandering in the wilderness. 6. The covenant at Mount Sinai. And 7. On the edge of the promised land. Each of the 4 sources, J, E, D, and P, include these 7 elements in some way. The Yahwist, or J source, refers to God as Yahweh and depicts God as having human qualities. God is anthropomorphic, walks and talks with the humans. The Yahwist probably wrote from the southern kingdom in Judah and records Moses encountering God at Mount Sinai. Genesis 2, in which the Lord God plants a garden and takes a rib from man to create woman, is an example of a J source text. Exodus 1 through 24 and Numbers 11 through 12 are also J source text. J distinguishes between clean animals, which can be slaughtered for food and sacrifice, and unclean animals, which may not, hence the 7 pairs and 1 pair in the flood narrative. J's account of the flood is structured in a 40-day and 7-day periods. We will see that another source, the P source, uses 150-day periods, and the flood lasts for a year and 10 days. J's flood is a result of a prolonged rainstorm. Something different in P source. The second source is the Elohist reworking of the basic Yahwist account. This source is abbreviated with an E and is also known as E source. Generally, scholars believe the E source does not include as much material as does the J story, and what it does cover tends to favor the northern kingdom and its ideas. For example, E source pays less attention to Abraham than to Jacob, a patriarch who lived in the area of Shechem, Bethel, and other northern cities. The Elohist refers to God as Elohim and depicts God as being transcendent. God is ethereal. God speaks in dreams and often communicates through messengers. Examples of E-source text include Genesis 22, the almost sacrifice of Isaac, the entire Exodus in Exodus 13, and the story of Balaam and the Moabites in Numbers 22-24. The E-source records Moses encountering God at Mount Horeb as opposed to Mount Sinai. The third source is the Deuteronomist source. The D source material is found in the book of Deuteronomy and stresses obedience to Moses' admonitions. The D source refers to God as Yahweh, has a more moralistic tone than the other sources, and is concerned with matters of the southern kingdom. Finally, the fourth source is the priestly source. This source is also known as the P source. The P source material was the last source to be put together. It was most likely penned at the end of the Babylonian exile or after the Israelites returned to Judah, to help people maintain their faith in the God of Israel, even when everything seemed to have been lost. P set out all the aspects of Israel's faith that were still valid. The P source includes in its story the reasons for keeping the Sabbath. We see this in Genesis 1. The origins of circumcision in Genesis 17. The divine command to obey all the cultic and religious laws. Leviticus 1 through 27, Numbers 1 through 10, and then again in Numbers 25 through 36. And the important role of the high priest next to Moses himself. We see that in Exodus 4:28, Numbers 1, and throughout the Pentateuch. The priestly source generally refers to God as Elohim, depicts God as being concerned with cultic or religious issues, and tends to focus on genealogies and lists. P is concerned with the unconditional covenants of God with Noah for humankind and with Abraham for Israel. P looks at the story of Israel's experience of God, the genealogies as threads joining key stories of Israel's becoming a people of God, the travel itineraries as threads joining key stories of Israel's journey from Egypt to Sinai and towards the Promised Land. P's account of the flood story differs from J's in several ways. P has no mention of any distinction between clean and unclean animals. P's picture of the flood is basically one of decreation. The waters that were pulled apart to create living space in Genesis 1 now surge together to blot out life in Genesis 6 through 9. P's flood lasts for a year and 10 days. This chart demonstrates the differences between the four sources or authors based upon Wellhausen's work. It will be important for you to remember elements of this chart. It will help you in this class as well as in your personal engagement with the biblical text. Before I move to my conclusion, I have one question for you to consider. Why might the documentary hypothesis be important for modern readers of the Hebrew Bible? One of the major long-held explanations for biblical contradictions, at least in the Pentateuch, is the documentary hypothesis. The documentary hypothesis applies to the Torah or the Pentateuch only. And importantly, perhaps the one book most people are familiar with, the book of Genesis. Your reading from Byrd takes up many interesting issues in the book of Genesis, as does the Collins book. All of this is meant to help you become more familiar with the documentary hypothesis. Thank you.